The silence of Maplewood Lane was shattered by the sharp crack of a car alarm, followed by the flicker of blue and red lights cutting through the night. Malcolm Evans stood rigid by his window, his phone clutched tightly in his hand as he stared across the street. His gaze was fixed on Nathan Carter, a man he barely knew but already mistrusted, hauling boxes into his new home. "He doesn't belong here," Malcolm muttered under his breath, his voice laced with contempt. Fueled by old fears and deep-rooted prejudice, Malcolm dialed 911, convinced he was protecting his quiet neighborhood. "911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice answered calmly. "There's a suspicious man on my street," Malcolm said, his voice tight. "He's moving things into a house, but I don't think he lives there." The call would ignite a series of events that would challenge long-held beliefs, unearth buried fears, combat, and ultimately reshape the entire community. At the heart of it all stood Nathan, a man who came to Maplewood Lane seeking peace but fought for respect, understanding, and belonging. Before we dive into this gripping story of conflict, transformation, and hope, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories that challenge prejudice and celebrate unity, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Nathan Carter's hands tightened around the steering wheel as his car glided through the gates of Maplewood Lane. The street stretched ahead like a postcard, come to life. Colonial-style houses with manicured gardens, red-tiled roofs, and the occasional glimmer of sunlight filtering through rows of sycamore trees. It was beautiful, no doubt about it, but something about its perfection made his chest tighten. "Here we are," Nathan said, glancing at his wife, Evelyn, seated beside him. She smiled softly, her warm eyes meeting his. "Our new home," he added, his voice tinged with nervous pride. A small voice from the back seat called, "Is that it, Dad? Is that our house?" Sophie, their 7-year-old daughter, leaned forward, pressing her face against the window. Her excitement was contagious. Evelyn turned around, her voice filled with warmth. "Yes, sweetie, that's it. What do you think? It's so pretty," Sophie exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "Can I pick my room?" Nathan chuckled, the sound breaking through the tension coiled in his chest. "Of course, you can. And there's a big backyard too. Perfect for playing and having adventures." The car rolled to a stop in front of number 38, a pristine colonial-style home with a wide porch and white railings. Nathan stepped out, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp autumn air. Pride swelled in his chest as he looked at the house, a tangible result of years of hard work and perseverance. "This is it," he murmured to himself, though the unease in his stomach didn't quite fade. Evelyn stepped beside him as he opened the trunk to unload their belongings. "It's beautiful, Nathan," she said, her hand resting on his arm. "We've worked so hard for this." "You've worked so hard for this." He gave her a small nod but couldn't ignore the feeling of eyes on him. He glanced across the street and caught movement in one of the windows. The curtain fluttered, and then a face disappeared behind it. Nathan's jaw tightened. He was no stranger to being watched, scrutinized, or judged. Still, the looks always stung, no matter how much he told himself otherwise. "Don't let it get to you," Evelyn whispered, following his gaze. "We belong here just as much as anyone else." "I know," Nathan replied, his voice low, "but moving into a neighborhood like this, it's not going to be easy." Evelyn turned to him, her expression resolute. "We'll make it. Sophie deserves a safe, welcoming place to grow up. We're here, Nathan, and this is home." As they began unpacking, Nathan noticed subtle movements around the neighborhood. A few doors opened and figures emerged. An older woman with silver hair stepped onto her porch and lingered momentarily. Nathan waved, and after a hesitant pause, she nodded back. It was a small gesture, but it eased some ache pressing on his chest. Nathan Carter's hands tightened around the steering wheel as his car glided through the gates of Maplewood Lane. The street stretched ahead like a postcard come to life. Colonial-style houses with manicured gardens, red-tiled roofs, and the occasional glimmer of sunlight filtering through rows of sycamore trees. It was beautiful, no doubt about it, but something about its perfection made his chest tighten. "Here we are," Nathan said, glancing at his wife Evelyn, seated beside him. She smiled softly, her warm eyes meeting his. "Our new home," he added, his voice tinged with nervous pride. A small voice from the back seat called, "Is that it, Dad? Is that our house?" Sophie, their 7-year-old daughter, leaned forward, pressing her face against the window. Her excitement was contagious. Evelyn turned around, her voice filled with warmth. "Yes, sweetie. That's it. What do you think? It's so pretty," Sophie exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "Can I pick my room?" The sound breaking through the tension coiled in his chest. "Of course. You can. And there's a big backyard, too. Perfect for playing and having adventures." The car rolled to a stop in front of number 38, a pristine colonial-style home with a wide porch and white railings. Nathan stepped out, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp autumn air. Pride swelled in his chest as he looked at the house, like a tangible result of years of hard work and perseverance. "This is it," he murmured to himself, though the unease in his stomach didn't quite fade. Evelyn stepped beside him as he opened the trunk to unload their belongings. "It's beautiful, Nathan," she said, her hand resting on his arm. "We've worked so hard for this. You've worked so hard for this." He gave her a small nod, but couldn't ignore the feeling of eyes on him. He glanced across the street and caught movement in one of the windows. The curtain fluttered, and then a face disappeared behind it. Nathan's jaw tightened. He was no stranger to being watched, scrutinized, or judged. Still, the looks always stung, no matter how much he told himself otherwise. "Don't let it get to you," Evelyn whispered, following his gaze. "We belong here just as much as anyone else." "I know," Nathan replied, his voice low. "But moving into a neighborhood like this, it's not going to be easy." Evelyn turned to him, her expression resolute. "We'll make it. Sophie deserves a safe, welcoming place to grow up. We're here, Nathan, and this is home." As they began unpacking, Nathan noticed subtle movements around the neighborhood. A few doors opened and figures emerged. An older woman with silver hair stepped onto her porch and lingered momentarily. Nathan waved, and after a hesitant pause she nodded back. It was a small gesture, but it eased some ache pressing on his chest. The first rays of morning sunlight broke through the curtains as Nathan Carter stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The fresh air was crisp and inviting, but the tension from the previous day still lingered in his chest. Maplewood Lane was quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds, and for a moment Nathan allowed himself to imagine that this was a place where peace could last. However, that illusion quickly shattered when he caught a glimpse of movement from the house next door. Malcolm Evans stood on his porch, his watering can in hand. The older man paused mid-motion as he noticed Nathan. Their eyes met briefly, and though Nathan raised his hand in a neighborly wave, Malcolm simply turned away, resuming his task as if Nathan didn't exist. Inside, Evelyn was busy unpacking boxes, while Sophie skipped around the living room, delighted to rediscover her favorite toys. "Daddy," Sophie called out, holding up a stuffed rabbit. "Can I take this to the backyard?" Nathan smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Just don't wander too far." Evelyn glanced at Nathan, her brow furrowing slightly. "How are things out there?" Nathan shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Quiet, but not exactly friendly." Evelyn sighed but didn't respond. Instead, she walked over to Sophie and knelt down. "Why don't we check out your new room later? We'll decorate it however you like." Sophie beamed. "Can we paint it purple?" "Purple it is," Evelyn replied with a smile, ruffling her daughter's hair. While the family tried to settle into their new life, Malcolm sat inside his home, staring at the Carter's house through a narrow gap in his curtains. His mind churned with unease. To him, Nathan and his family were intruders disrupting the order of Maplewood Lane, a neighborhood he had called home for decades. The memories of the break-in years ago replayed vividly in his mind. Malcolm had been the one to notice the suspicious activity at his neighbor's house and call the police. Though the burglars had escaped before law enforcement arrived, the incident left him with a lingering sense of paranoia. He had since developed a habit of monitoring every unfamiliar car, delivery person, and passerby who entered the street. And now there was the Carters, a family that, to Malcolm, didn't fit the mold of Maplewood Lane's longtime residents. "They're different," he muttered to himself, his grip tightening around the curtain. Later that afternoon, Nathan was unloading a box from the trunk of his car when he noticed Malcolm's unrelenting gaze from the neighboring window. Suppressing a sigh, he forced himself to smile and wave again. Malcolm didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his phone and dialed a number. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's calm voice answered. "This is Malcolm Evans," he began, his tone firm. "There's a suspicious man on my street. He's been moving things into the house all day, and I don't think he lives here." "Can you describe the individual?" the dispatcher asked. Malcolm hesitated, his voice lowering. "He's a black man. I mean, he doesn't look like anyone who belongs here." The dispatcher paused. "Sir, moving items into a house isn't illegal. Do you have any evidence of suspicious or criminal behavior?" "I'm telling you, he doesn't belong," Malcolm insisted, frustration lacing his voice. "This neighborhood is safe and quiet. I don't want any trouble here." After a long silence, the dispatcher reluctantly agreed to send a patrol car to check things out, warning Malcolm about the consequences of making a false report. As Nathan carried the box toward the house, the distant sound of sirens drew his attention. His steps faltered as a police car turned onto Maplewood Lane, its red and blue lights flashing. Evelyn appeared at the door, her expression filled with worry. "Nathan," she called out softly. "What's going on?" Nathan set the box down and turned to her with a reassuring look. "Stay inside with Sophie. I'll handle this." He walked down the steps as two officers exited the patrol car, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The older officer, whose badge read Miller, approached Nathan with a cautious demeanor. "Good afternoon, sir," Officer Miller began. "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address. Can you explain what's going on?" Nathan kept his tone polite. "Of course, officers. My name is Nathan Carter. My family and I just moved in yesterday. Do you have any paperwork to confirm that?" Miller asked, his expression neutral but firm. "Certainly." Nathan retrieved the deed to the house and his ID from his wallet, handing them over without hesitation. Miller examined the documents while the younger officer, Daniels, remained on edge, his gaze fixed on Nathan as though expecting trouble. "Are you sure this is your house?" Daniels asked, his tone sharp. Nathan met Daniels' gaze steadily, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, officer. And if you need further confirmation, I'm the newly appointed sheriff for this area. I begin my duties next week." Both officers froze. Miller glanced at the documents again, his eyes widening as he read the name. "Sheriff Carter," he murmured, his voice tinged with surprise. Nathan gave a small nod. "That's right. My family and I moved here to be closer to the community I'll be serving. I thought it was important to live where I work." Daniels stammered, his earlier skepticism dissolving into discomfort. "I didn't know. Sorry, sir. We were just following protocol." Nathan offered a faint smile. "I understand, but I hope this serves as a reminder to avoid making judgments based solely on appearances." From behind his curtains, Malcolm watched the exchange with a sinking feeling. The word sheriff echoed in his mind, accompanied by disbelief and a hint of shame. As the officers left, Nathan returned to the porch, where Evelyn stood waiting. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. "It's fine now," Nathan replied, though disappointment lingered in his eyes. "But clearly, not everyone here is happy to see us." Evelyn took his hand, her gaze steady. "We'll prove them wrong, Nathan. You're a good man, and they'll see that." Nathan nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He glanced at the house next door, where Malcolm's curtain twitched. The challenge had only just begun. As the evening settled over Maplewood Lane, Nathan Carter sat at the kitchen table, lost in thought. The earlier police visit weighed heavily on his mind. He had spent years proving himself in his career and his community, but moments like this reminded him of how much further there was to go. Evelyn placed a cup of tea in front of him and sat across the table. "You've been quiet since they left," she said gently. "Are you okay?" Nathan sighed, running a hand through his short, pale, dark hair. "I knew moving here wouldn't be easy, but I didn't think it would start like this. Being questioned in front of our home. It's hard not to feel like I'm back at square one." Evelyn reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Nathan, you've overcome worse. You faced prejudice your whole life, but it never stopped you before. This is just another challenge." Nathan nodded, though the frustration in his chest didn't ease. He glanced at the living room, where Sophie was curled up on the couch, fast asleep. Her innocent face was a reminder of why they had made this move. "I just don't want Sophie growing up thinking this is normal," Nathan said, his voice quiet but firm. "She deserves to feel safe and welcome, not judged because of who we are." "She will," Evelyn assured him, "because we'll show her what strength and integrity look like, and we'll show this neighborhood who we really are." Nathan smiled faintly, appreciating her unwavering support. "You're right. We didn't come this far just to turn back now." The next morning, Nathan resumed his efforts to settle in, determined to put the previous day behind him. He mowed the lawn, greeted passers-by with friendly waves, and tried his best to project an air of confidence. Some neighbors responded with cautious nods, while others avoided his gaze entirely. The tension was palpable, but Nathan remained resolute. Across the street, Malcolm Evans watched from his window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The interaction with the police had left him unsettled. Learning that Nathan was the new sheriff had thrown him off balance, challenging his deeply ingrained assumptions. "He might be the sheriff," Malcolm muttered to himself, "but that doesn't mean he belongs here." Despite his misgivings, Malcolm couldn't shake the growing sense of doubt creeping into his mind. His daughter, Clara, had called him out on his attitude just the night before. "Dad, you barely know them," Clara had said, her voice tinged with frustration. "You can't just assume the worst because they're different. Give them a chance." Malcolm had dismissed her words at the time, but they lingered now, much to his annoyance. Meanwhile, Nathan and Evelyn were making small but meaningful strides in connecting with their new community. One neighbor, Margaret Harper, an elderly woman with a kind smile, had stopped by to introduce herself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Margaret said warmly, handing over a plate of cookies. "I know it can be a little daunting at first, but if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Evelyn replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. "That means a lot to us." Nathan smiled, grateful for the kindness. "It's good to know there are people like you here." Margaret chuckled. "Don't mind the others. Some people around here don't take well to change, but they'll come around. They always do." Her words offered a glimmer of hope, though Nathan knew the road ahead would still be difficult. As the days passed, Nathan decided to take a proactive approach. He drafted invitations for a community meeting at the local neighborhood center, hoping to introduce himself formally and address any concerns. "This is a great idea," Evelyn said as they folded the invitations together. "It's a chance to show them who you really are." Nathan nodded, though he couldn't ignore the small knot of anxiety in his stomach. "I just hope they show up." When the day of the meeting arrived, Nathan stood at the front of the neighborhood center's hall, scanning the room. The turnout was sparse, but a few familiar faces, including Margaret, had shown up. Nathan took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for coming. I know the past week has been eventful, to say the least. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce myself properly and share my hopes for this community." He spoke with sincerity, sharing his vision of a neighborhood built on trust, safety, and mutual respect. He emphasized his commitment to protecting everyone, regardless of background, and encouraged open dialogue. While some attendees listened attentively, others, like Malcolm, remained stoic, their skepticism evident. When the floor opened for questions, Malcolm was the first to speak. "Sheriff Carter," he began, his voice clipped, "you talk a good game, but how do we know you're here for the right reasons? This neighborhood has been peaceful for years. We don't need change for the sake of change." Nathan met Malcolm's gaze steadily. "I'm not here to disrupt anyone's way of life, Mr. Evans. I'm here to ensure that Maplewood Lane remains a safe and welcoming place for all its residents. But that means we all need to work together." Malcolm scoffed but said no more. As the meeting concluded, Nathan couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and hope. Later that evening, Evelyn found him sitting on the porch, gazing out at the quiet street. "How do you think it went?" she asked. Nathan shrugged. "It's a start. Not everyone is ready to accept us, but I think a few of them are willing to try. That's all I can ask for." Evelyn sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Change takes time, Nathan, and you've never been one to back down from a challenge." Nathan smiled, though his thoughts remained heavy. He knew this was only the beginning. Across the street, Malcolm stood by his window, watching the Carter's house. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, pride in his neighborhood's traditions clashing with the nagging sense that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The following days brought a mix of progress and unease to Maplewood Lane. Nathan Carter continued his efforts to integrate into the neighborhood, but the sense of scrutiny never entirely faded. Though a handful of neighbors had begun to exchange polite greetings, most still watched him with suspicion. Despite this, Nathan remained determined to make a difference. Each morning he greeted passers-by with a warm smile, worked on improving his property, and even played catch with Sophie in the front yard, hoping to show the neighborhood that his family was no different from theirs. However, not everyone shared his optimism. Across the street, Malcolm Evans sat with a group of like-minded neighbors in his living room. The curtains were drawn, and the atmosphere in the room was tense. "This neighborhood has always been peaceful," Malcolm began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "We've all worked hard to maintain that. But since the Carters arrived, it feels like everything's changing." A middle-aged man named Roger, who lived a few houses down, nodded in agreement. "I've seen them outside every day trying to fit in. But who knows what they're really up to? People like them always bring trouble." "Exactly," Malcolm said, leaning forward. "We need to be vigilant. We can't let this disrupt the life we've built here." The group murmured in agreement, their voices overlapping with whispers of prejudice and fear. Unbeknownst to them, Malcolm's daughter Clara stood just outside the living room door, listening intently. Her brow furrowed as she heard their conversation, and she finally stepped inside, her presence startling the group. "Dad," she said firmly, her arms crossed, "what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Malcolm glanced at her, his expression hardening. "Clara, this isn't your concern. We're discussing the future of this neighborhood." "The future?" Clara scoffed. "All I hear is a bunch of baseless assumptions about a family you don't even know." "Have you ever spoken to Nathan Carter, or are you just going to keep hiding behind your curtains?" Malcolm's face flushed with embarrassment, but his resolve didn't waver. "You don't understand, Clara. This isn't about them personally. It's about protecting what we have here." "Protecting it from what?" Clara shot back. "From a family that wants the same things we do? A safe place to live? A chance to raise their child in peace? You're so focused on preserving the past that you're blind to the opportunity right in front of you." The room fell silent as Clara's words hung in the air. Malcolm didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, his pride preventing him from admitting that she might be right. Meanwhile, Nathan was busy planning his next move to foster goodwill in the community. With Evelyn's help, he decided to host a small gathering at their home, a casual event where neighbors could get to know them better. They sent out handwritten invitations, hoping the personal touch would encourage attendance. The day of the gathering arrived, and Nathan worked tirelessly to prepare. He set up a barbecue in the backyard, while Evelyn and Sophie decorated the space with balloons and colorful tablecloths. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of cheerful music. As the event began, a few neighbors trickled in, their expressions cautious but curious. Margaret Harper was the first to arrive, carrying a tray of brownies. "Bookmark? This is a lovely idea, Nathan," she said with a warm smile. "It's about time this neighborhood had a reason to come together." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," Nathan replied, shaking her hand. "It means a lot to have your support." Gradually, more residents joined, though their interactions with the Carters remained reserved. Conversations were polite but brief, and Nathan could sense the underlying tension. Across the yard, Malcolm stood with Roger and a few others, watching the event from a distance. "They're putting on quite a show," Roger muttered. Malcolm didn't respond. His gaze shifted to Sophie, who was laughing as she played tag with a few neighborhood children. The sight stirred something in him, a flicker of doubt, though he quickly pushed it aside. As the sun set, Nathan took a moment to address the group. He stood on the back porch, his voice steady but heartfelt. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "I know that change isn't always easy, and I understand that my family's arrival may have raised some questions. But we're here because we believe in this community. We want to contribute to its safety, its growth, and its future." His words were met with a mix of polite nods and skeptical glances. Nathan pressed on, determined to make his intentions clear. "I also want to invite you all to the community meeting I'll be hosting next week at the neighborhood center," he continued. "It'll be a chance for us to share ideas and discuss ways to make Maplewood Lane an even better place for everyone." Margaret clapped softly, her support evident, while others exchanged hesitant looks. As the event came to a close, Malcolm lingered on the sidewalk, watching as the Carters cleaned up. Clara approached him, her arms crossed. "Well?" she asked, her tone challenging. "What did you think?" Malcolm shook his head. "They're trying too hard. It doesn't feel genuine." "Or maybe," Clara countered, "they're just trying to make the best of a difficult situation." "You could at least give them a chance, Dad." Malcolm didn't respond, but the weight of her words settled heavily on him as he walked back to his house. That night, Nathan sat on the porch, watching the streetlights cast a soft glow over the quiet road. Evelyn joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did your best, Nathan," she said gently. "It's not enough," Nathan replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I won't give up. Not for Sophie, not for us." From his own porch, Malcolm sat silently, staring at the Carters' house. For the first time, his unwavering certainty began to crack, leaving him with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite name. It was a calm evening on Maplewood Lane when the tranquility was shattered by the sound of a car alarm blaring. Nathan Carter, sitting in his living room with Evelyn, immediately sprang to his feet. Through the window, he could see a group of neighbors gathering near the end of the street, their faces lit by the flashing lights of a patrol car. "What's going on out there?" Evelyn asked, concern etched across her face. "I'm going to find out," Nathan replied, grabbing his jacket. "Stay inside with Sophie." As he approached the scene, he quickly pieced together the situation. A neighbor's window had been broken, and a shadowy figure had been spotted fleeing into the darkness. The police were already on site, their flashlights sweeping across the lawns and hedges. Nathan's presence immediately caught the attention of the officers, and one of them, a young patrolman named Vargas, stepped forward. "Sheriff Carter," he said, recognizing him. "We've got a suspected break-in. No one's been hurt, but the suspect is still at large in the area." Nathan nodded, his professional demeanor taking over. "All right, let's get organized. We'll split into 2 teams. One team will secure the perimeter and ensure no one else is at risk. The other will search for the suspect." "I'll join the search." His calm authority steadied the nerves of the officers, who quickly followed his instructions. As Nathan joined the search team, he couldn't help but notice Malcolm Evans standing among the small crowd of onlookers, his expression a mixture of unease and suspicion. "Stay alert," Nathan advised his team as they moved through the neighborhood, checking backyards and alleys. After a tense half-hour, the suspect was located hiding behind a row of hedges near the edge of the neighborhood. Nathan approached cautiously, his voice steady but firm. "Come out with your hands up. This doesn't have to escalate." The suspect hesitated, but eventually complied, stepping into the beam of a flashlight with their hands raised. Nathan gestured to one of the officers. "Cuff him and read him his rights." As the situation de-escalated, Nathan took a moment to ensure everything was in order. He personally reassured the affected residents, explaining the steps being taken to prevent further incidents. "This is a safe neighborhood," he told the homeowners, "and we'll make sure it stays that way." His professionalism and empathy left a strong impression, not just on the victims, but on the gathered crowd. For the first time, some of the skeptical neighbors seemed to soften their attitudes. Among them was Malcolm, who had watched the entire incident unfold from a distance. He couldn't deny that Nathan had handled the situation with efficiency and care, far from the disruption Malcolm had feared. Later that evening, as the patrol cars drove away and the street returned to its quiet state, Malcolm approached Nathan, who was speaking with Evelyn on their porch. "Nathan," Malcolm said, his tone hesitant but less cold than before. Nathan turned, his brow lifting in surprise. "Mr. Evans." Malcolm looked down for a moment as if searching for the right words. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did tonight. I might have been wrong about you." Evelyn glanced at Nathan, her expression a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. Nathan extended his hand, a small smile on his face. "I appreciate that, Mr. Evans. It means a lot." Malcolm shook his hand, though the gesture felt stiff, as if he were still grappling with his own emotions. "Good night," he said curtly before turning to leave. Evelyn waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. "That's progress, isn't it?" Nathan nodded, though his gaze remained on Malcolm's retreating figure. It's a start. The incident became a turning point for the neighborhood. Word of Nathan's decisive actions spread quickly, and more neighbors began to warm to him, if only slightly. Margaret Harper was particularly vocal in her praise. "I knew he'd be an asset to this community," she told anyone who would listen. "He's not just the sheriff, he's of us now." However, not everyone was convinced. A small group of residents, led by Roger, remained resistant to change. They held private meetings, discussing ways to protect the neighborhood from what they saw as unwelcome influence. One evening, during one such meeting, Clara confronted her father again. "Dad, I heard about what happened the other night. Nathan handled it perfectly. Doesn't that prove he's here to help?" Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, Clara. Maybe he's just good at his job, but that doesn't mean I have to trust him." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've always cared about this neighborhood, Dad. That's why you're so protective. But maybe it's time to protect it by being open to change, not fighting it." Her words stayed with Malcolm long after she left. He found himself replaying the events of that night in his mind. Nathan's calm leadership, the way he reassured the neighbors, even his willingness to step into danger for a community that hadn't fully accepted him. The next day, Malcolm attended a community meeting Nathan had organized. Though he sat quietly in the back, his presence didn't go unnoticed. Nathan made a point to acknowledge him, his expression one of quiet respect. During the meeting, Nathan outlined his plans for improving neighborhood safety, from better lighting to a community watch program. His ideas were met with a mix of support and skepticism, but his sincerity was evident. "I'm not here to change what makes Maplewood Lane special," Nathan said. "I'm here to make sure everyone feels as safe and welcome as they deserve to be." As the meeting concluded, Malcolm lingered, watching Nathan interact with other residents. For the first time, he began to wonder if his assumptions about the Carters and change itself had been wrong all along. The morning after the community meeting, Maplewood Lane buzzed with a quiet energy. Conversations rippled through the neighborhood about Nathan Carter's proposed safety initiatives. Some were intrigued, others still skeptical, but the meeting had undeniably sparked a shift. In his living room, Malcolm Evans sat by the window, sipping his coffee and staring at Nathan's house. Clara entered the room, holding her own cup of tea. "Dad," she began cautiously, "I saw you at the meeting last night. That was a big step." Malcolm grunted, but didn't reply, his gaze fixed outside. "You know," Clara continued, sitting beside him, "Nathan didn't have to step up like he did during that break-in. He could have left it to the officers, but he didn't. That says a lot about his character." Malcolm sighed, setting his coffee down on the table. "I've lived here my whole life, Clara. I've seen this neighborhood change, and not always for the better. I just want to protect it." Clara's voice softened. "I understand, Dad, but sometimes protecting something means letting it grow, even if it's uncomfortable at first." Malcolm didn't respond, but her words lingered in his mind. Meanwhile, Nathan was working tirelessly to build trust. He had scheduled another meeting, this time focusing on community activities to strengthen bonds among the residents. Evelyn and Sophie pitched in, crafting colorful flyers and delivering them door to door. "Are you sure about this?" Evelyn asked as they walked down the street, Sophie skipping ahead with a stack of flyers in hand. Nathan smiled. "It's worth a try. The more people get involved, the better chance we have of turning this neighborhood into a real community." Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Margaret Harper was the first to show her support, promising to help spread the word. "You've got the right idea, Nathan," she said warmly. "People just need a little push sometimes." When the day of the event arrived, the turnout exceeded expectations. The neighborhood center bustled with activity as residents gathered to discuss ideas for future events and improvements. Nathan took the opportunity to encourage everyone to share their thoughts. "We all have something to contribute," he said, his voice steady and inviting. "This is about building something together, something we can all be proud of." For the first time, Malcolm raised his hand. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "I've lived here longer than most of you," Malcolm began, his voice low but firm. "And I'll admit I wasn't sure about all of this at first. But after what happened the other night, I realized I might have been looking at things the wrong way. Nathan listened attentively, his expression encouraging. Malcolm continued, I still think this neighborhood needs to stay safe, but maybe the way to do that is by working together instead of drawing lines between us. The room broke into soft applause, and Malcolm returned to his seat, his cheeks slightly flushed. Clara, sitting nearby, gave him a proud smile. After the meeting, Nathan approached Malcolm. I appreciate what you said today, Mr. Evans. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong. Malcolm nodded, though his expression remained serious. Don't get me wrong, Carter. I'm not completely sold yet. I'm willing to try. That's all I can ask, Nathan replied with a smile. The event marked a turning point for Maplewood Lane. Over the following weeks, residents began to participate more actively in community initiatives. Families mingled at neighborhood gatherings, children played together on the sidewalks, and the once icy atmosphere started to thaw. Malcolm found himself reluctantly drawn into the activities. He attended a gardening workshop Nathan had helped organize and even suggested a book exchange program for the neighborhood. Clara noticed the change in him and couldn't hide her delight. You're starting to see it, aren't you? She teased one evening as they walked home from a community meeting. See what? Malcolm grumbled, though his tone was lighter than usual. That may be Nathan's exactly what this neighborhood needed, Clara said. Malcolm didn't reply, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Despite the progress, Nathan knew there was still work to be done. Some residents remained distant, unwilling to let go of their prejudices entirely. But he took comfort in the small victories, the friendly waves from neighbors who once avoided him, the shared laughs at community events, and the growing sense of belonging for his family. One afternoon, as Nathan and Sophie were planting flowers in their front yard, Malcolm approached. He held a small bag of seeds and cleared his throat awkwardly. I thought these might look nice, Malcolm said, holding out the bag. Nathan took it with a grin. Thanks, Mr. Evans. I appreciate it. Sophie looked up from the dirt, her hands covered in soil. Can you help us plant them? She asked innocently. Malcolm hesitated, glancing at Nathan, who gave him an encouraging nod. Finally, Malcolm knelt down beside Sophie and began helping her dig. Evelyn watched the scene from the porch, her heart swelling with hope. It's happening, she said softly to herself. As the sun set that evening, Nathan stood on the porch with Evelyn, looking out at the street. It was the same Maplewood Lane, but it felt different now, warmer, more inviting. We've come a long way, Evelyn said, leaning against him. We have, Nathan agreed. But there's still more to do, and we'll do it, Evelyn replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. Together. Across the street, Malcolm sat on his porch, watching the Carter's house with a contemplative expression. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of possibility, as if the neighborhood he had tried so hard to protect might become something even better than he had imagined. The days that followed brought a flurry of activity to Maplewood Lane. News of Nathan Carter's efforts to foster unity continued to ripple through the neighborhood, reaching even the most skeptical residents. Yet, the lingering tension hadn't entirely disappeared, and Nathan knew there was still resistance to overcome. One afternoon, as Nathan returned from the grocery store, he noticed Clara Evans standing on the sidewalk near his driveway. She seemed to be waiting for him, her arms crossed and her expression resolute. Clara, Nathan greeted as he stepped out of his car, carrying a bag of groceries. What brings you by? I wanted to talk, Clara replied, her voice steady. Do you have a minute? Nathan nodded. Of course. What's on your mind? Clara hesitated, then spoke with conviction. I know my dad hasn't made things easy for you, and to be honest, he can be stubborn, but I think he's starting to come around. Nathan set the grocery bag on the hood of his car, leaning against it. I've noticed some changes in him lately, he admitted. Small ones, but they're there. Clara smiled faintly. He doesn't say it outright, but I think he respects you. That break-in and how you handled it shook him. He realized that you're here to help, not to disrupt. I appreciate you saying that, Nathan said sincerely. It's not always easy to see progress when you're in the middle of it. Clara shifted her weight, her tone becoming more determined. I want to help. I've been thinking about ways to get the rest of the neighborhood involved. Maybe if we plan an event, a big one, it'll give people a chance to connect and move past their doubts. Nathan considered her suggestion. That's a good idea. What kind of event are you thinking? A block party, Clara said, her eyes lighting up. Something casual where families can bring food, kids can play, and people can just talk. No pressure, no formal speeches, just neighbors getting to know each other. Nathan smiled. I like it. And with your help, I think we can pull it off. They spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, from potluck dishes to activities for children. Clara offered to take the lead on spreading the word, promising to convince even the most reluctant neighbors to attend. By the end of their conversation, Nathan felt a renewed sense of hope. Clara's enthusiasm was infectious, and her willingness to bridge the gap between her father's generation and newer residents was exactly what the neighborhood needed. Over the next week, preparations for the block party were in full swing. Clara rallied a group of volunteers to help with decorations and logistics, while Nathan coordinated with Evelyn and Sophie to handle the food and games. Flyers were distributed to every house on the street, and the excitement began to build. On the day of the event, Maplewood Lane transformed. Long tables lined the street, covered with an array of homemade dishes, desserts, and drinks. Balloons and colorful streamers hung from lampposts, and a small sound system played upbeat music in the background. Families arrived gradually, bringing their contributions to the potluck and chatting in small groups. Children darted between the tables, laughing as they played tag and participated in games set up in the park. Nathan stood near the grill, flipping burgers and greeting attendees as they approached. Evelyn managed the dessert table with Sophie by her side, the little girl proudly handing out cookies she had helped bake. Margaret Harper was one of the first to arrive, beaming as she surveyed the lively scene. This is exactly what this neighborhood needed, she told Nathan, handing him a plate of brownies. Bookmark. Thank you for being here, Mrs. Harper, Nathan replied. It wouldn't have been possible without everyone's support. As the party continued, Nathan noticed Malcolm Evans standing at the edge of the gathering, his expression unreadable. Clara stood beside him, gently nudging his arm. After a brief pause, Malcolm began walking toward Nathan. Malcolm, Nathan greeted warmly, extending a hand. I'm glad you came. Malcolm shook his hand, his grip firm but his demeanor guarded. Clara insisted, he said gruffly, though there was a flicker of warmth in his eyes. Well, I'm grateful she did, Nathan replied. I hope you enjoy yourself. For the next hour, Malcolm remained on the periphery of the event, observing quietly. But as the evening progressed, he began to mingle. To Nathan's surprise, he joined a group of residents discussing ideas for future neighborhood projects. His tone was cautious but constructive, and his input sparked thoughtful conversations. Clara approached Nathan with a grin. Told you he'd come around. Nathan chuckled. You were right, and I'm glad he's here. As the sun set, the block party reached its peak. Families gathered around a makeshift stage, where a group of neighborhood kids performed a short skit they had rehearsed. Laughter and applause filled the air. And for the first time since Nathan's arrival, Maplewood Lane felt like a true community. When the performance ended, Nathan stepped onto the stage to address the crowd. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming tonight, he began. This isn't just about one event, it's about what we can achieve together. This neighborhood has so much potential, and I'm honored to be a part of it. The crowd erupted in applause, their enthusiasm genuine. Even Malcolm joined in, his expression softening as he clapped alongside his neighbors. As the evening wound down, Nathan and Evelyn worked together to clean up, with help from Clara, Malcolm, and a few other residents. The camaraderie that had formed throughout the event was palpable, and Nathan couldn't help but feel optimistic about the future. That night, as Nathan sat on the porch with Evelyn, watching the quiet street, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. We did it, Evelyn said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. We did, Nathan agreed, his voice filled with quiet pride. But this is just the beginning. There's still more work to do. And we'll do it, Evelyn replied with a smile. One step at a time. Across the street, Malcolm stood on his porch, watching the Carter family with a thoughtful expression. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a recognition that the neighborhood he loved could grow and thrive in ways he had never imagined. The success of the block party rippled through Maplewood Lane, leaving a lasting impression on its residents. For many, it marked a turning point. a moment when they began to see Nathan Carter not as an outsider, but as a dedicated neighbor. However, the change wasn't universal, and Nathan knew there were still barriers to overcome. One chilly morning, Nathan sat at his dining table with Evelyn, reviewing notes from the recent neighborhood meetings. Sophie, seated nearby, was busy coloring a picture of the block party, complete with balloons and smiling neighbors. "Look, Dad," Sophie exclaimed, holding up her drawing. "That's Mr. Evans." Nathan chuckled, noticing the detailed depiction of Malcolm standing next to Clara. "You're getting really good at this, kiddo. Maybe I should hang that in my office when I start next week." Evelyn smiled, but then grew serious. "You've made a lot of progress here, Nathan, but I can tell some people are still hesitant." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change takes time, and I can't force anyone to accept us. But I can keep showing them who we are, day by day." Later that afternoon, Nathan decided to pay Malcolm a visit. Armed with a loaf of fresh banana bread Evelyn had baked, he walked across the street and knocked on Malcolm's door. The older man answered after a moment, his expression cautious. "Nathan," he greeted, stepping aside. "Come in." Nathan entered, noting the neatness of the house. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, handing over the bread. "Evelyn made this, and we thought you might like it." Malcolm took the loaf, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's kind of you," he said gruffly. "I also wanted to thank you for being part of the block party," Nathan continued. "It meant a lot to see you there, and I think it meant a lot to the other neighbors too." Malcolm sighed, setting the bread on the counter. "I won't lie, Nathan. I've struggled with all of this. For years, I've been stuck in my ways, convinced that change would only bring trouble." Nathan listened patiently, sensing the weight of Malcolm's words. "But seeing you with your family," Malcolm continued, his voice quieter now, "and the way you handled that break-in, it made me realize that maybe I've been wrong. Maybe the trouble isn't what's new, it's the fear of it." Nathan nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Fear has a way of controlling us, Mr. Evans. I've lived with it my whole life, being judged, being doubted, even when I've done nothing wrong. But I believe we can overcome it, if we're willing to try." Malcolm met Nathan's gaze, and for the first time, there was no trace of suspicion in his eyes. Instead, there was a glimmer of understanding. "I want this neighborhood to thrive, Nathan," Malcolm said finally. "And if that means embracing change, then I'm willing to try." Nathan extended his hand, and Malcolm shook it firmly. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of progress, a bridge being built after years of division. The following week, Nathan began organizing a new initiative, a mentorship program for the neighborhood's youth. The idea was simple but impactful, pairing adults with young residents to foster connections and share knowledge. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Margaret Harper volunteered to teach a gardening class, while Clara offered to lead art workshops. Even Malcolm surprised everyone by agreeing to mentor a group of teens in woodworking, a skill he had honed over decades. At the first mentorship meeting, Nathan stood before a room of eager participants, his voice filled with excitement. "This program is about more than skills," he said. "It's about building relationships, learning from each other, and growing together." The room buzzed with enthusiasm as the mentors and mentees began to mingle. Malcolm, though initially reserved, found himself sharing stories about his early days as a carpenter, and the teens listened with genuine interest. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere was electric. Nathan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched neighbors of all ages connecting in ways he had hoped for since the day he arrived. As the weeks passed, Maplewood Lane began to transform. The mentorship program flourished, with regular workshops and activities bringing residents closer together. The once quiet street now hummed with life, from children laughing in the park to neighbors chatting over shared projects. Nathan's leadership extended beyond the neighborhood as well. His position as sheriff allowed him to implement community-focused policies, ensuring that Maplewood Lane and its surrounding areas remained safe and inclusive. Despite the progress, there were still moments of doubt. Nathan occasionally overheard whispers or noticed lingering glances, but he reminded himself that change wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. One evening, as Nathan returned home from work, he found a letter waiting for him in the mailbox. It was from Malcolm. Inside was a simple note. Nathan, thank you for reminding me what it means to be a good neighbor. Malcolm. Nathan smiled, folding the note and tucking it into his pocket. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to affirm that the journey they had started together was worth every challenge. That night, Nathan sat on the porch with Evelyn, the cool breeze carrying the faint sound of children playing down the street. Sophie joined them, curling up beside her father with a book in hand. "This feels like home," Evelyn said softly, her gaze sweeping over the now familiar neighborhood. Nathan nodded, his arm around Sophie. "Because it is. And it's not just for us. It's for everyone here." Evelyn smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've built something incredible, Nathan, and it's only the beginning." As the streetlights illuminated Maplewood Lane, Nathan felt a profound sense of peace. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led to something extraordinary. A neighborhood where unity and understanding could flourish, one step at a time. As spring settled over Maplewood Lane, the neighborhood came alive with new energy. The mentorship program Nathan Carter had initiated was thriving, and weekly workshops and gatherings had become a cornerstone of community life. Residents who had once been wary of change now embraced it, seeing firsthand how connection and cooperation could transform their neighborhood. One sunny Saturday morning, Nathan and Evelyn stood in the neighborhood park, overseeing preparations for the latest community event, a spring festival. Long tables adorned with fresh flowers lined the pathways, and booths offering crafts, baked goods, and games were scattered throughout the area. Sophie, with a clipboard almost as big as she was, directed volunteers with the confidence of a seasoned organizer. "The balloons go there," she called out, pointing to a bench. "And the face painting station needs more chairs." Evelyn chuckled, watching their daughter. "She's got your leadership skills," she told Nathan. Nathan smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "She's got your determination." As the festival began, residents arrived in droves, their excitement palpable. Families mingled, children raced between activities, and laughter filled the air. Even those who had once kept to themselves were now engaging with their neighbors, sharing stories and smiles. Malcolm Evans arrived with Clara, carrying a tray of sandwiches for the potluck. His demeanor, once guarded, had softened considerably over the past few months. As he set the tray on the table, he spotted Nathan near the grill and made his way over. "Nathan," Malcolm greeted, extending a hand. "This is quite the turnout." Nathan shook his hand warmly. "It's good to see you, Malcolm, and thank you for helping out with the sandwiches." Malcolm shrugged, though there was a hint of a smile on his face. "It's the least I could do. Besides, Clara wouldn't let me sit this one out." Clara, overhearing, chimed in with a grin. "That's because you're an important part of this neighborhood now, Dad." The comment made Malcolm pause, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. For years he had seen himself as the protector of Maplewood Lane, guarding its traditions and its peace. But now, he realized that being part of a community meant more than just preserving the past. It meant embracing the future. As the day unfolded, Nathan took a moment to reflect on how far the neighborhood had come. He stood beneath a sprawling oak tree, watching Sophie and a group of children play tag while Evelyn chatted with Margaret Harper and other neighbors nearby. The sight filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. When he and his family had first arrived, they were met with suspicion and resistance. Now, the same neighbors who had once kept their distance were working together, united by a shared vision of a better community. That evening, as the festival wound down, the residents gathered around a bonfire in the park. The warm glow of the flames illuminated their faces as they shared stories, laughed, and reflected on the day. Nathan stood to address the group, his voice carrying over the crackling fire. "I want to thank each of you for being here today," he began. "This festival is more than just an event. It's a celebration of what we've built together. Maplewood Lane has become more than a neighborhood. It's a community, and that's something truly special." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the night. As Nathan sat back down, Malcolm leaned over, his tone uncharacteristically earnest. "You've done something remarkable here, Nathan. I never thought I'd see this neighborhood like this." Nathan met Malcolm's gaze, his smile genuine. "We all did this, Malcolm. It took everyone's effort to make this happen." Malcolm nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. And I'm glad I finally realized it before it was too late." Across the circle, Clara watched her father with a mixture of pride and gratitude. She knew how hard it had been for him to let go of his old ways, but seeing him connect with Nathan and the community filled her with hope for the future. The weeks that followed were filled with new initiatives and collaborations. The mentorship program expanded, with more residents volunteering their time and skills. Clara's art workshops grew so popular that they had to be moved to a larger space, and Malcolm's woodworking classes became a favorite among the teens. Sophie flourished in the supportive environment, her laughter often echoing through the streets as she played with her new friends. Evelyn, too, found her place in the community, organizing book clubs and neighborhood cleanups that brought even more residents together. Nathan, meanwhile, continued to lead with quiet strength. As sheriff, he worked tirelessly to ensure the safety and well-being of not just Maplewood Lane but the surrounding areas as well. His commitment earned him the respect and trust of his colleagues and the community alike. One evening, as the family sat on their porch enjoying the cool breeze, Evelyn turned to Nathan. "Do you remember the first night we moved here?" Nathan chuckled. "How could I forget? It feels like a lifetime ago." "It does," Evelyn agreed, her voice soft. "But look at how far we've come. This place really feels like home now." Nathan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the now familiar houses and the quiet street. "It's not just a home for us, it's a home for everyone here, and that's what makes it special." As the streetlights illuminated Maplewood Lane, Nathan felt a profound sense of peace. The road had been long and challenging, but it had led to something extraordinary, a community united by trust, understanding, and shared purpose. Across the street, Malcolm sat on his own porch, watching the Carters with a small smile. For the first time in years, he felt truly content, knowing that his neighborhood was in good hands. The transformation of Maplewood Lane was undeniable. What had once been a neighborhood defined by division and suspicion was now a vibrant community where residents of all ages, backgrounds, and perspectives came together with a shared purpose. For Nathan Carter and his family, it was a testament to the power of persistence, patience, and belief in something greater. One sunny afternoon, Nathan found himself standing in front of a packed room at the neighborhood center. The walls were adorned with photos from recent community events, children playing at the block party, neighbors working together on a garden project, and smiling faces from the mentorship program. Nathan looked out at the crowd, his heart full. The meeting had been called to discuss plans for the upcoming summer fair, but it had turned into something more, a celebration of how far they had come. Before we dive into planning, Nathan began, his voice steady. "I want to take a moment to reflect. When my family and I first moved here, we didn't know what to expect. We knew it would be a challenge, but we believed in this neighborhood. And now, looking around this room, I see what makes Maplewood Lane so special. The people. Each of you has played a part in making this community what it is today." The room erupted in applause, and Nathan couldn't help but smile. Among the crowd, Malcolm Evans clapped loudly, a proud grin on his face. As the applause died down, Malcolm stood, surprising everyone. "I'd like to say something," he said, his deep voice commanding attention. Nathan nodded, stepping aside to give Malcolm the floor. "When the Carters first arrived, I'll admit, I wasn't welcoming. I let my fears and my prejudices guide me, and I'm not proud of that. But over the past few months, I've seen what true leadership and community spirit look like, and it's because of Nathan and his family. They didn't just talk about change, they made it happen, even when people like me doubted them." Malcolm paused, his voice softening. "Nathan, you've shown me what it means to be a good neighbor, and for that, I'm grateful. You've reminded me that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to be better." The room was silent for a moment before breaking into another round of applause, louder and more heartfelt than before. Nathan approached Malcolm, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you." "Malcolm," Nathan said, his voice filled with emotion. "That means more than I can say." After the meeting, residents lingered to chat and share ideas for the summer fair. Clara approached Nathan, her smile radiant. "My dad's come a long way," she said. "And it's thanks to you." Nathan shook his head modestly. "He's the one who made the choice to change. I just gave him a reason to." Clara laughed softly. Well, whatever you did, it worked. I've never seen him so invested in the neighborhood. As the room emptied, Nathan walked home with Evelyn and Sophie, their footsteps echoing softly against the quiet street. You know, Evelyn said, slipping her hand into Nathan's, this neighborhood feels completely different now. It does, Nathan agreed, looking around at the familiar houses. But it's not just the neighborhood, it's the people. They've shown that change is possible when you're willing to try. Sophie tugged at Nathan's sleeve, her bright eyes full of curiosity. Dad, do you think our neighborhood will always be like this? Nathan knelt down, meeting her gaze. I hope so, sweetheart. But keeping a community strong takes work. It's something we all have to keep building, every day. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. I'll help too. Nathan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. I know you will. That weekend, the Carters hosted a small barbecue at their house, inviting neighbors from across the street and beyond. Malcolm and Clara arrived early, carrying a tray of homemade cookies. Margaret Harper brought her famous potato salad, and families filled the backyard with laughter and conversation. As the sun set, Nathan gathered everyone around the patio for a toast. Holding up a glass of lemonade, he spoke with conviction. To Maplewood Lane, he said. To friendship, understanding, and the community we've built together. May it continue to grow stronger every day. The group cheered, raising their glasses in unison. Later that night, after the last guests had left, Nathan sat on the porch with Evelyn, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. You've done something amazing here, Evelyn said, resting her head on his shoulder. Not just for us, but for everyone. Nathan gazed out at the street, his thoughts drifting to the journey they had taken. I couldn't have done it alone, he said. It took all of us working together to make this place what it is. Evelyn smiled, and that's exactly why it'll last. As the weeks turned into months, Maplewood Lane continued to thrive. The neighborhood became a shining example of what could be achieved when people set aside their differences and worked toward a common goal. Nathan's efforts as both sheriff and neighbor became a source of inspiration, not just for Maplewood Lane, but for the surrounding communities as well. One day, as Nathan walked Sophie to school, she turned to him with a smile. Dad, do you think I can help people too when I grow up? Nathan knelt down, placing a hand on her shoulder. You already are, Sophie. Every time you're kind, every time you stand up for what's right, you're making the world better. Sophie beamed, her small hand slipping into his as they continued down the street. For Nathan, it was a reminder of why he had fought so hard, not just for his family, but for the future. Maplewood Lane wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was a place where hope had taken root, and that was more than enough. As he watched Sophie run into the schoolyard, her laughter ringing out, Nathan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had been worth every step. Maplewood Lane was more than a neighborhood now. It was home. The story of Nathan Carter and his family is a powerful reminder of how determination, empathy, and resilience can dismantle even the most deeply rooted prejudices. It paints a vivid picture of the struggles that come with being perceived as an outsider, yet it also shows the incredible transformation that can occur when we choose connection over fear and division. Nathan's journey highlights the importance of taking action, no matter how small, to foster understanding and build bridges between people. It's a testament to the idea that communities thrive not when everyone is the same, but when differences are embraced and used as strengths. Through patience, courage, and a steadfast belief in the goodness of people, Nathan turned suspicion into trust and isolation into unity. The lessons from Maplewood Lane are clear. Change is possible, but it requires effort from all sides. It starts with a willingness to listen, to challenge our own biases, and to take steps toward understanding others. Every action, no matter how small, has the potential to spark a ripple effect, inspiring others to follow. This story isn't just about one man or one neighborhood. It's about the universal potential for humanity to grow and come together when we focus on what unites us, rather than what divides us. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't hesitate to share your own stories of community and transformation. Let us know how you've seen connection and understanding make a difference in your life or the lives of others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the meaningful stories we have coming up. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And let's keep this conversation about hope and unity alive.